Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. This video is a reading list video about Latin, a reading list for learning the Latin language. Now, I've done a lot of reading list videos on languages before, but this one is going to be a little bit different. And I'll tell you what the difference is in just a moment. But first, I would like to ask you to be sure and subscribe to the channel, to like the video, to share it, and if you find these videos to be useful, I would also ask you to consider joining my Patreon page. I've made a number of language learning reading list videos before this, 5 in all. They were mainly geared toward Islamic studies, people who were either involved or about to get involved in that field, and how to go about learning the key languages for research in that field. So the first video I made was about Arabic, then there was Persian, then there was Turkish, then there's Urdu, and then I did the fifth video on Hebrew and Syriac together. In the case of all of these languages, except for Urdu, I studied them in some form or another, formally at university or at institutes, academic institutions, educational institutions, whether universities or not. In the case of Latin, however, this is something which I've been teaching myself. I also was, for many years, homeschooling my kids, and part of the homeschooling curriculum that we did was also Latin. Latin is extremely important, just as in for Islamic civilization, the two key languages are Arabic and Persian. Really, for Western civilization, the two key languages are Greek and Latin. So there's a tremendous importance for both of these, Latin in particular. People who know English can easily start this and begin the study of Latin because there's no new writing system to learn. That's not the case with something like Arabic or Persian, where you have this whole additional learning curve, so to speak, where you have to learn a script that's unfamiliar to you. The same is true in Greek, maybe somewhat less so, but still, it's an alien script for speakers of English. You don't have that problem with Latin, so you can immediately jump in. There will be a certain amount of adjustment, of course, because pronunciation is different, but you don't have that problem, and you have the added advantage of there being many, 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 many words in the English language that have a Latin origin. So it's also very useful for that. Now, really the best book, in my view, for learning Latin is actually not one book, but it's a series of books, and this is the main or first textbook in that. It's called Lingua Latina, and this book was written by a guy named Hans Orberg, and what distinguishes this book is it proceeds according to a method called the intuitive method. If we just read the book description on the back, Hans Orberg's Lingua Latina per se illustrata is the world's premier textbook for learning Latin via what is called the natural method. The natural method means, and I quote, "Students first learn grammar and vocabulary intuitively through extended contextual reading and an innovative system of marginal notes. It is the only textbook currently available that gives students the opportunity to learn Latin without resorting to translation, but allows them to, quote-unquote, think in the language." Now, that is extremely important, because when learning any language, the most difficult thing, I think, is to actually learn or acquire an active as opposed to a passive knowledge of the language. A lot of language books, especially the ones intended for self-study, have a very tried and true approach. They introduce some basic grammatical rules in English, right? And they introduce a basic vocabulary. And then they have some sort of exercises, simple sentences, and then you develop up to longer passages in the language, which then you are supposed to translate into English. And sometimes they incorporate English into the language as well. And that's the harder part. English into the other language is a more active skill. And then actually being able to easily read that language and then even compose sentences in that language, that takes a long time to develop. But with this system, you are forced to develop those skills from the very first moment you began your study of the language. So Lingua Latina is, I think, a really excellent book. It consists of 35 lessons, and you can work through this in about a year. In the beginning, it's really quite easy, and it gets a little bit harder. And somewhere around chapter 4 or 5, or even chapter 6, 7, or maybe even chapter 8, depending how on your own skill, it gets considerably harder. But each lesson is very digestible and can easily be worked through. You can do a few lessons a week, and you can easily finish this book in about a year. Now, this is a whole system. So it's not just this book, but it comes with an exercise book, and I really think you need to have the exercise book as well. And the problem is that these books are not really very affordable. They are kind of expensive. You can often find them used as well. But having said that, I think that they're well worth the price. You'll have to check it out on, let's say, Amazon. And I will provide links to all of these books in the video description. And you can see what they're selling for now. I mean, I bought these some years ago, and I'm sure, just like everything else, the price has gone up. If you also want detailed answers and so forth, you can get the book, the teacher's manual or the teacher's materials that goes with it. There are some additional resources that you can get. You can get a glossary of the whole book, so you don't have to compile one as you go along. It's very thin. It's basically a pamphlet, but this has every vocabulary, every word that's used, and this is the only book that actually gives meanings in English. Otherwise, everything else, you've got to figure it out as you go along intuitively by the intuitive method. So naturally, it might be a good idea to have a dictionary. Fortunately, you can get Latin English and English Latin dictionaries rather cheaply. I bought this used many years ago for about $3. You can go to places like Half Price Books, and they also have a website, Half Price Books. You can go to Abe Books, the Advanced Book Exchange. Amazon also offers, used books. So you can easily find a used Latin dictionary of this kind. And it doesn't really matter whether it's Castle's, whether it's Oxford, whether it's Langenscheidt, there's all sorts of publishers. You just need a basic one that you can use. Another little booklet that's also part of the series has all of the grammar, but it's the grammar summarized again in Latin. So that's Lingua Latina per se illustrata, Grammatica Latina. And then there is a kind of student's manual. This is in fact very useful. And this is in English and explains a lot of the background to the readings, and it's called Latine Disco. This has nothing to do with Latin dancing or anything like this. It's a student's manual. It includes a guide to pronunciation, instructions and information on the main points in each chapter. And so this is very useful if you're working all by yourself or homeschooling. I'm just getting that from the back of the book. So that's the whole sort of series. There are additional, like if you want additional stories, and I should say that each lesson in Familia in this book, you can see that the subtitle is Familia Romana. And so the whole book, all 35 lessons, center on stories about a family from ancient Rome. And so there is a kind of connection between each lesson. And you see this family, and they have a bunch of kids, and they have some slaves, and one day something gets stolen, and they suspect one of the slaves, and so on and so forth. And it's just a story that develops and unfolds. If you want additional stories that, in fact, go with that theme, there is a separate book with a blue color called Lingua Latina Colloquia Personarum that you can get. Now, if you work through this one book in a year, you will have access to, you'll have a very good basic knowledge of Latin. Now, my own interest in this was, I'm very interested in philosophy. If you are a regular on my channel, regularly watch my channel, then you'll know that I'm very interested in subjects in comparative religion, philosophy, comparative philosophy, things of this nature. And Latin is extremely important in philosophy, to say the least. A lot of philosophical terms that we use in English come from Latin or Greek, or in fact are combinations of those. So that will give you a very good basis. If you want to go further, there is a second volume, like a second year to the course, which is called, again, Lingua Latina. And the subtitle of this one, there's, of course, as Pars, it's part 2, is Roma Eterna, eternal Rome. And so there's more sort of, not really stories, but actual extracts adapted somewhat from ancient authors. So learning a language, especially a so-called dead language like Latin, I really don't think that's very accurate to say it's completely dead. As long as people learn a language and use it in some way or another, it remains alive in some sense or another. But there is a culture. So just like with Arabic or with English or with French, there's a certain culture, and there are certain linguistic and sociolinguistic and cultural background to any language. The same is true for Latin, and Latin has a very long history, but of course it's associated, it starts with ancient Rome. So there's a very good book called A Natural History of Latin. Again, you can get this used. I was very fortunate. I found one in mint condition, hardcover with the dust jacket. It's an OUP, or Oxford University Press, so it is kind of expensive if you buy it new. But I found this in a half-price bookstore for about $8. And it gives you, it's very readable. The subtitle is The Story of the World's Most Successful Language. And it is one of the world's most successful languages. So this gives you a very good background about the language. Let's just have a quick look at the table of contents. Latin and the Romans. So things like philosophy, Lucretius, Cicero, Seneca, the language of history, rhetoric, Latin and Europe. Latin was extremely important in the Middle Ages. It continued to be extremely important in the Renaissance. It continued to be important well into the pre-modern age, 19th century, even early 20th century. So that's about 180 pages about, really the history of the language. The rest of the book is about the grammar. That's, if you're studying from the Lingua Latina books, you probably don't need that, but nevertheless, it gives you a nice overview in English, because Lingua Latina doesn't, of the grammar. And there's in fact a rather extensive basic vocabulary appended to the end of the book as well, that extends for about how many pages? Let's see, it goes from page 220 to 269. So that's almost about 50 pages there of basic vocabulary, and there's even a lot of common phrases and expressions, especially if you are an academic and you read academic writing. There's a lot of Latin expressions that are used, abbreviations, things like this. So this is an extremely useful book to have as well. Finally, there's another book called Latin Story of a World Language by Jürgen Leonhardt. I found this to be a very interesting read. He argues that, Latin really is not a dead language, that it continues to be relevant and important. And in fact, the blurb on the back is even written in Latin. So this guy is quite a Latin enthusiast. He sees Latin as a world language, and it certainly had that status, at least throughout Europe, for a very, very long time. And I really think it's one of the most interesting books I ever read on the history of a language before. Finally, just a little note. I first really got interested and inspired to actually take up learning Latin once when I was on a visit to the UK for a conference, and I was walking around, and I went into a bookshop, and I came across this little book called Gwyn's Latin. And I thought, oh, this is an interesting little book. Gwyn's Latin, the ultimate introduction to Latin, including the Latin in everyday English. And it was pretty inexpensive, and I thought, this is something interesting to read. And so I picked it up, and I think it would be pretty hard to learn Latin from this book, but you actually could certainly get started. It's got all of the rules and so forth, but I just found this to be Very well written, very interesting case he makes for Latin. So Mr. Gwynn, who wrote the book, is very upset that Latin no longer forms the basis of education in the Western world. There was a time when it did. It was one of the most important subjects. It was really one of the first subjects, I should say, that children would learn in so-called grammar school. And when they studied grammar, that's what they meant, grammar of the Latin language. And so that went along with the whole idea of the liberal arts, the three basic liberal arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So I also found this to be a very interesting read. So you may also find it to be interesting. So I'm just putting that there. So this is my recommendation for learning Latin. And again, if you are on a limited budget and you don't want to buy a lot of stuff, then I think the bare minimum is just these two. The Lingua Latina textbook plus the exercise workbook, and then just get yourself a dictionary from somewhere. I mean, you can get a smaller one than this for just only a few dollars if you just look hard enough. So I wish everybody every success in learning Latin, and please do give me your comments and suggestions. Thank you for watching.